ماشي كويس يعني؟ مش مشاكل؟ مش مشاكل؟ Scheduling resources and costs. Once we develop the project network, the next step is basically we need to convert this network into what we call a schedule and a cost refund. What is the meaning of these two things? Project network components are not a schedule until resources have been assigned to it. And cost estimates are not budgets until they have been time-based. These two statements are very crucial. First step is we develop the work breakdown structure of the project. Then from this work breakdown structure, we estimated the costs and the time of each activity. The next step was we developed a project network to calculate the activity times, the total project duration, and all these things. But now we need to assign resources. For any project in the world, we have several types of resources, basically people, equipment, capital, whatever the resources that we need to assign those resources to the different activities. Once we assign those resources, then we will develop what we call a schedule. That schedule means it's the timetable that each and every resource will have. I'll assume that all the resources needed are only people. Okay, for example, basically you need to have your schedule. Your schedule means that you have a lecture today at 10 a.m. Okay, if you know that the lecture is today at 10 a.m. without assigning a resource for this lecture, which is me as an instructor, then it's just a network plan. We cannot consider it a schedule because you don't have resources assigned to it. That's why we need to assign this resource. The second point is we need to assign costs for the cost estimates for this network plan in order to get what we call a budget. Why do we need to know what to get the budget? In order to manage our cash flow. When exactly do we need have money? When exactly do we need to disperse money from the budget of the project? Okay, yes, they set the budget for the project like $5 million, and it's in the bank. Are we going to leave it in the bank? Are we going to withdraw 1 million, let's say today, and 1 million next week? Or we need to know exactly when do we need the money? In order to buy something, in order to pay the wages, in order to perform the activities of each activity of the project. Okay? The implicit assumption that resources will be available in the required amount when needed. Basically, this is the assumption that we assumed when we developed our project network. This one. The implicit assumption is that resources will be available in the required amounts when needed. When we're considering our project planning, the network plan that we developed last week, for example, we did not say that we don't have resources. We do not say that the resources will not be available or we don't have enough resources. We just assume that the resources are there and they're available with the amounts that we need them. Okay? However, practically speaking, this is not the case. This is not usually the case. Okay? That's why we need to think about this assumption. This assumption is not very practical. That will raise what we call the resource problem. That's what we are going to discover today. Okay? Definitely, if we added several projects together, okay, one is making realistic judgments on resource availability and project durations. If we are a company that has several projects are running concurrently, then we need to think about this issue as well. Okay. Resource constraint scheduling. What do we mean by constraint scheduling? Resource constraint scheduling. When we develop our network, then we come out with some resource constraints, some problems with our resources. That's why it will create what we call resource constraint scheduling. The solution for this is to do what we call resource leveling or smoothing. Resource leveling or smoothing involves attempting to even out demands on resources by using Slack, relaying non-critical activities to manage resource utilization. We are going to see an example right now of this resource problem. Okay. Usually what happens is in some durations or some phases of the project, you find that you have a very high utilization of your resources, actually overloading your resources. And in some other areas, some other times or durations, you will find your resources are underutilized. What you need to do is you need to do what we call leveling. Okay? That leveling, what you are going to do it, it's going to help us actually to use our resources optimally. However, sometimes when we do this leveling, we might turn out to be or to extend the project duration. Sometimes we can do that. But what if we have a time constraint again? So we have these two cases that we need to look for. Okay. But at the end of the day, we have, after we developed our network, we assign the resources to each activity, then we do have the schedule. And once we did this schedule, we need to do this resource leveling. Even if the project is okay, because definitely some of the resources will be overutilized. Okay? If resources are not adequate to meet the peak demands, here we are talking demands for the resources, not demands of the market. The late start of some activities must be delayed and the duration of the project may be increased. This process is called resource constraint scheduling. Okay? We have two cases here that we need to discriminate between them. First of all, am I going to stick to the deadline of the project? Then, in this case, if you remember the triangle of the project, we have the cost, we have the performance, we have the time. If we are going to constrain the time, then we have to increase the cost in order to have the same performance. Increase the cost means increasing the resources. Okay? Or the other case is I need to have restrictions. So I have restrictions about the resources themselves. I have constraints about the resources. Then I have to expand the project time. Okay? So it's either or. It's one of those two cases. Resource the types, the absence, shortage, or unique relationship and interaction, characteristics of resources that require a particular sequencing of project activities, that's what we call resource constraints. Basically, we can have technical, logical constraints. What do we mean by technical? What do we mean by logical constraints? Technical constraints, basically, constraints related to network sequence in which project activities must occur. Technically, I cannot lay down the cables before just digging the trench. Okay, this is a technical restriction. I cannot do this activity unless I finish digging. I cannot just lay the cable on the ground, just like that. Okay, so this is what we call a technical or logical constraint. And actually, when we developed our network, we use this. We use this constraint. I mean, there are some activities that cannot start unless other activities finish. Okay? Just like the example of laying down the cables, which is basically a technical constraint. Or physical constraint activities cannot occur in parallel or are affected by contractual or environmental conditions. Some other activities, they cannot go in parallel. because of some contracts, because of physically no resources available, because of environmental conditions, because of whatever. So this is what we call physical constraint. Technically they can go in parallel, but practically speaking we cannot develop or we cannot perform those activities in parallel because of delay in contract, for example. Okay, so we call it physical constraint. Look at those examples. First one is an example of if we are building this one, store, poor frame roof, then end. This is if you are building a house. Of course, this is a very simple example. The other one is if you are developing a software, design, code, and test and activity. Okay? These types of technical constraints, we cannot build the columns and the roof and all these things before we pour the construction, the concrete at the beginning. We cannot develop the code for the software unless we finish the design. So this sequence here of those activities has to go in this way. We cannot change them. We cannot do them in parallel. Okay. ينفع نبني عمود الشكل زي ما نحط القواعد 19 سنة؟ ما ينفعش. ما ينفعش نعمل حتى splitting. We cannot split those activities. لازم احط العمود القاعده بتاعت الخرسانه الاول كامله وبعد كده احط العمود. وبعدين ما ينفعش ان انا اجي اصب مثلا 5 6 قواعد وابتدي اطلع بالاعداد بتاعتهم وابتدي اعمل بعد كده السقف وبعدين ابتدي اكمل بقيه القواعد. هي theoretically تنفع بس practically لا ما تنفعش عشان تبقى الدنيا موزونه. practically مش دايما بنعمل كده، بنعمل القواعد كلها اول حاجه الدنيا كلها بعد كده السقف مرة واحدة إن شاء الله عشان الدنيا مظبوطة. Okay. Resource constraints. On the other hand, imagine that this example, if you are just preparing for a wedding reception, need to plan, then you purchase refreshments, decorate the hall, hire the band, and then do the reception. You cannot do the reception unless you finish all these 3 things, 3 activities. However, those 3 activities are independent, so I can do them in parallel. Okay, so it's the opposite of the examples in this technical constraint. There are no technical constraints here. However, imagine that you are the only one who's responsible to carry out those activities. Will you be able to do those activities at the same time? Yes, that's fine. If no, then you have to do them sequentially because you have physical constraint here. You don't have enough resources. Okay? So instead of just doing them in parallel, like you would just do them in sequence. Okay? Tons of resource constraints, basically people, material, equipment, working capital, different types of constraints that we do have. Usually if we have shortage of people, if we have shortage of material, if we have shortage of working capital, practically speaking, the most 2 resources that affect our projects basically are people and working capital. Usually we do have shortage in those. Or the constraints will come basically from one of those at least. Classification of scheduling problem is just, first of all, to classify the problem, we first use the priority matrix. You remember the priority matrix that we described in chapter 4.2, I guess. 3 or 3. Okay, which is something that we must do, something that we can enhance, and something we can accept. We are going to use this matrix because at this stage we definitely have our priority matrix, and we can use it and also in order to say what kind of resources that we can reschedule, what kind of resources that we can sacrifice, what kind of constraints that we do have. Do we have a constraint over time, so we cannot extend our project to the end, or we don't have a problem of time and we do have problems of constraints on resources, then we have a physical constraint on that in this case. Time constraint project, a project that must be completed on a proposed date. Time is fixed, resources are flexible, additional resources are required to ensure the project meets schedule. Or resource constraint project, which is a project in which the level of resources available cannot be exceeded. Resources are fixed, time is flexible. We cannot have both. It's impossible. Inadequate resources will delay this project. So at the end of the day, either to bring in more resources, which is extra cost, or to stick to your resources and extend the time. It's one of the cases. Okay. Resource allocation methods, the limiting assumptions that we need to think about or to consider on how to allocate our resources to the different activities of the project. First of all, splitting activities is not allowed. We need to do this assumption at the beginning. Does this mean that we cannot split our activities? Does this mean that we cannot split our activities? Okay, let me say that again. Now, these are the two types of projects, the classification of the resource problems that we do have. If we have a time constraint project, means that time is critical. Do you think that for any activity, we do have a problem of resources since the resources are available or are flexible? When we are going to allocate the resources to the different activities, to the network activities in order to develop the schedule, do you think that we do have a problem here in the resources for the time constraint projects? For the time constraint projects, where time is fixed, you cannot change the time, and you have flexible resources. Flexible resources. Do you think that we do have a problem here in the resources?
Flexible resources.
Supposedly no. Supposedly no. Right?
Even flexible resources doesn't mean that it is enough. Flexible دي معناها انه انا اقدر انوفر الناس، ده مش معناها ان still
okay.
not enough.
Okay. Assume that flexible means enough.
لا يبقى خلاص.
Okay. On the other hand, the second case, if we have a project that has a certain level of available resources, we cannot exceed that level, then the flexibility here is going to be on time, so we can extend this project. The problem is that, as you just raised, those time constraint projects, sometimes we have a restriction on time, and we have restrictions on resources as well. Yes, this is practically what's happening, and we need to think about this problem and how to solve it. Okay, in solving those resources, what we usually do is we start our resources. We start assigning each and every resource to the network plan. Okay, remember the let's make this. This is a network. Okay? What is written in the middle box here is the resource. Assume it's 2P, whatever, but we are talking about a resource called P, whatever it is. For this